right, our puppets.
Good morning. Good morning.
Okay, we got some announcements this morning.
Oh, yeah. We get to do. Who gets to go first on the announcements?
Wendy.
Oh, Wendy. Okay.
Mother-daughter retreat is coming up.
Oh, that's right. The daughters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do I go next?
No.
What happens at those? That's just ladies too. Mm-hmm. Oh, but I.
What's that?
This Wednesday we're actually starting our practice for the Wednesday.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a song.
Oh, you got a song for it?
No.
Amen by Tuesdays.
And actually it was two of every kind, and then there were also the animals for the sacrifices and for the food. And so the song doesn't really. What?
I don't think they'll be singing that for Resurrection Sunday. But last week, you did the lesson by yourself, Lucky, right?
But there was a big puppet that helped me out. That was unfortunately he's not here today. But Steve actually helped me understand. He helped me understand what the lesson was that right. But David did, and David didn't wait for somebody else to do it. He did what he knew somebody needed to do that he was capable of doing. Whew, that was a quick recap.
But it's cool to look at the faith of the people in the Bible like that.
Oh, it is, yeah, like David, and there's all kinds of folks that we see their faith.
Yeah, like Noah.
Oh, Noah. Oh, that was with the twosies and yeah. I know stuff about Noah. Noah built an ark. It was a huge ark. And in the water while the rain came down.
For hundreds of years.
About while he was building the ark, he was being ridiculed and made fun of.
Yeah.
Is that why they were making fun of him, or was it? So we should step in and do things that
even when other people don't approve.
To keep for James or others. But it's a lesson for all of us that we need to do what's right and worry about pleasing the Lord and not pleasing those that are around us. Because if we worry about pleasing our friends or those that are in our family, things like that, it might keep us from the great things that God has for us. Mm-hmm. Ooh, this is a good one. Okay, so we don't wait for others. When we see the need, we jump in, and then we don't worry about what others say as long as we're doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord. Oh, okay. So you guys got that one? Do right in the eyes of the Lord, no matter what's going on around you. For us at the fort, ole.
Ole.
It's important for all of us. We learn it at a young age, but we have to keep practicing it. Congratulations if your entire family unit made it this morning. There are very few whole family units that made it this morning. But this morning, we are right here. Theron is doing double duty back there, Saturday, teaching Sunday school, and
All right. Does this work? Oh, jackpot. There we go. Okay. Is that on? Is that okay? Coming through? Okay, because I can run back there and I'm probably fine. Okay. 1 John chapter 2 is where we're going to be. I think I just said okay like 12 times in 8 seconds. Sorry. My brain's trying to shift gears. 1 John chapter 2 is where we'll start. We'll be flipping around a little bit this morning in both your Bibles. And if you brought this, we'll kind of be looking at a few things in there. If you don't have it, it's fine. But the last several weeks, Josh Mendoza started us off looking at just, I guess, the idea of salvation. Took a couple weeks to talk through that. Last week, the other Josh talked through eternal security was kind of his topic from, I guess it would have been chapter 2. And this week, we're moving into this idea of the confession of sin. A lot to cover just in general, different ideas of this and different things to kind of address as we work through it. But again, salvation, eternal security, we're talking specifically about the confession of sin. We are in the realm of what I'm just calling the Christian life. So as we talk about the confession of sin, it's important to note that we aren't talking about, like this morning is dealing specifically, again, it's not the idea of losing your salvation and needing to confess after that. But it's the, I guess we'll talk through it, but of identifying sin within our own lives. And we say confessing, which at its core is the idea of agreeing with God about our sin. and then seeking forgiveness through Christ. And I think a good way, again, I just say when we talked about last week was, Josh touched on this, like the relationship and the fellowship. There's a difference between the two. And I think if I remember correctly, in this session, I had it bookmarked. Where is it? Yeah, he has it on page 54. So it's like the second page on this idea of confession of sin is essentially what he's dealing with. Is, again, you have relationship, so that solid line on the outside, the line is unbroken, it's permanent. It has to do with our eternal destiny, so salvation in heaven, and that's our relationship with God. So as you talk through salvation and eternal security, those two things are, we say, sealed in that outside line. That's kind of represented by that thick, bold line. And then you have inside that rectangle is the dotted line, and that represents our fellowship with God. It does have, we say, ebb and flow dependent on obedience. It impacts our prayers, as we will kind of talk through a little bit this morning. And again, there is joy and peace, or we say correction and discipline, which correction and discipline is some of what we're talking about this morning. There is sort of an ebb and flow in our lives as Christians as we choose to either fight sin or give in to it. And then confessing is, again, as we kind of walk through it, dealing with just identifying that sin in our life and kind of moving forward. So the relationship is kind of dealing with salvation and redemption. That's a fact that cannot change. But then our fellowship kind of deals with growth, sanctification, our closeness to God. And this does kind of ebb and flow dependent on some of the choices that we make. One of my favorite quotes, it's just an idea, and this is a basic principle that I'm kind of getting at, is that your choices matter. The choices that you make have an impact. And it's just something that somebody had shared with me that's always helped me, is just that future idea of the decisions I'm making, is that I do right today so that I can be in a better place to follow and honor God tomorrow. And that idea just helps you constantly process that there are consequences when I sin that don't just impact me right now. They can impact me in the future, even if it's not some huge thing. But it's that constant idea of doing right and moving forward. And I'm always doing right today so that I'm in a place to honor and follow God tomorrow. And so that your choices matter is kind of that basic principle. And he has a little bit of that idea on page 53. His quote, just in the opening chapter, he says, "Although you cannot lose your salvation, sin can certainly damage your fellowship with God." And so that's kind of what he's moving for. And I appreciate that he starts off the chapter that way, to understand this doesn't have to deal with your eternal destiny. This just has to do with the reality that even as a Christian, like one guy said it basically, when you get saved, God doesn't like take away your sin nature. That, like, as far as in this world right now, that's something that we still wrestle with and fight with as Christians. So within that reality, how do I deal with sin as a Christian who is still feeling that conflict in my flesh that you see in Romans 7 and other passages that we'll briefly look at this morning. So I forgot I'm the one making that happen. This is just a brief outline of the chapter. So committing sin, and just the page numbers on the right. So there's sort of it's this like progressive thing. There's the committing of sin. There's consequences of sin. He works through the discipline for sin and then conviction of sin. I really think you could probably blend those two together the way that he does it, which is kind of what I'm going to do. But that discipline and conviction kind of tied in together, and then basically just ending with, okay, when we say confess your sin to God, as a believer, what does that actually look like? How do we do that? And again, the Bible gives a great sort of outline to follow that helps us do it the way I say biblically. That'll give some guidelines to that as well. So I did have you turn to 1 John, and that's where we're going to at least start this morning. And the first, I say, step number one is that idea of committing sin. This is covered on pages kind of 55 and 56. And I'm just going to read 1 John. It's 1 John chapter 21 sins. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous, and he himself is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the whole world. Again, there's a lot in there, but there is sort of this basic premise of acknowledging the reality of sin. I know that Pastor David went through 1 John, and I went back on my notes just to kind of remember what he talked about in this passage. And again, this sort of basic idea of it comes back to agreeing with God about salvation. Your choice to either give in to sin or fight sin, it matters. Like your decision in that struggle has an impact in your life as a believer. And actually, if you move through 1 John chapter 2 and really the rest of the book in different ways, you do find that he basically says, if we love God, then you will follow and obey him. And then it's even echoed in like James chapter 2, where he says, like, a faith that doesn't produce fruit, that's a problem. Like true faith always produces righteousness, and there's kind of fruit within that. But we go back to this idea with sin, but then you have the immediate comfort of we have an advocate before the Father. So even as a Christian, Christ in sin is still the hope that I have. Basically says that we can never be sinless, but as we grow, we should be sinning less. My OCD likes to play on words there. And I do think as a general principle, that's a good statement as far as summarizing this idea that as we grow, we should be finding progress and maybe some of the things that we all struggle with. Another kind of great example of this in 1 Corinthians 6:11 of just talking about it. Again, not going through the whole passage, but Paul talking to the church in Corinth, which if you're familiar with the book, what consumes you, that's not who you are. And again, I just tie that back to that 1 John 2, where yes, we no longer live in sin, and the reality that we still fight sin is that Christ is still our advocate. He is still our mediator, and there's comfort and hope in that. And I do have it on the screen, page 56, and he does kind of have that basic statement where he says, as a Christian, the bottom of page 56, if you're looking at it, you will still struggle with sin, and he says the key word there is struggle. If you do not care that you sin, and you do not battle the tendency to sin, then the Bible would say that you've never been saved. You will inevitably follow your own desires and the influences around which will lead you away from God. And so again, it just comes back to that idea of, again, are you fighting sin? Are you resisting sin? And if you're not wrestling and fighting, that should be sort of a red flag in some form. And I have noted this before. It's interesting if you read like James, especially James chapter 4, and other passages that even Paul uses, a lot of like war language. If you look at some of the Greek wording that he uses, some of it is like very military terminology used in Greek. And I've even just, when I used to do teens, I used to tell them, like, there's a reason God, the armor of God is not like the three-piece suit of God. Like, it's the tie of faith and the pen of righteousness. Like, it's the chest, the breastplate and the helmet and the sword and the shield. That it's all this very military, like it's a battle. The Christian life is a battle. And if it wasn't that, again, if you were saved and God just took you, then, I guess that would be the easy way out. But the reality is, that the New Testament presents the Christian life as sort of a war zone, that we war against principalities and powers and all these. So again, you have that terminology. But that idea of fighting, are you fighting sin? Are you resisting sin? Are you pushing against it? But this baseline reality that we're not God, therefore we're not sinless, and so we do fail and we do struggle. And so when you look at the reality of committing sin, there is a reality, again, that we do fail. We do struggle. We have thoughts we shouldn't have. We say things we shouldn't say. We make choices we shouldn't make. And we do fail. And that's where we kind of move into this, I say, the consequences of sin. And if you can turn there if you'd like. I'm going to read most of them, but Isaiah 59 is where I'm going to be next. And I think Isaiah 59, it's verses 1 and 2, basically are just kind of giving a really good synopsis of what we would say are just sort of I guess you could say the general consequences of sin that are going to happen, I say, every time to some extent. But it's Isaiah chapter 59. We'll look at why is all sin serious? And again, all sin is an offense against a holy God. So you have this baseline principle and teaching, and had just a few passages there, like James 2 talks about you offend one law, you're an offense against the whole law because of the holiness of God, basically. So the law is that based on the character of God. So if you fail in one aspect, the whole point is all sin is serious because all sin is an offense against a holy God. But we go into, again, you say you make the decision to sin, that there are always consequences that are going to result of that, regardless in a sense of what the situation is. To give you maybe a practical example of this, at school this week in history class, we're kind of into the 20th century now in 5th and 6th history. And we started talking about like the 50s and 60s, and you had like Richard Nixon and Watergate. And it's a really interesting, I'm just a history nerd, so I think it's fascinating. And I've been to the Watergate Hotel, so I don't know why. Well, anyways, I just think it's cool that I've being able to be there, even though it's more of a controversy. But whatever. I wasn't part of Watergate, so we're good. But the whole point, again, when you look at that, the way that it all unfolded, you have this decision to try to basically gain information that they weren't supposed to have. Then there's a approval to try to cover it up. Then there's a lie about it. Everything gets exposed. And then finally he's like, okay, yeah, that happened. And we kind of used it in history classes. I was talking to them as an example. The whole thing, lying makes everything worse. And you can see that in Nixon's failure in a lot of different ways. But then I kind of turned it and just said, now, let's just say hypothetically, he still makes the wrong decision, but as soon as it happens, he comes out and he's honest about it. Does that mean there's no consequence at all? And thankfully they understood, like, yes, that even if he still made the poor decision to do this and he immediately came clean, there still would have been serious political consequences for him regardless. Now, does lying make everything worse? Yes. I try to teach that to my kids as best I can. Lying makes everything worse, but the reality is that when you choose to sin, sometimes, or really in this case we'll see, there are always consequences that are going to happen regardless of, I say, extenuating circumstances. So you look at Isaiah 59, and it says, behold, verse 1, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, nor his ear heavy, that it cannot hear. But this is where we kind of get into those consequences. But your iniquities have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. And this is a passage that he brings up in the book. But just, I'm making a quick turn here, but just looking at verse 2, what are some of those, we just say, immediate consequences of sin in general? So he lists, I guess, 2 or 3 in there. But what are some of the consequences in that verse that Scripture is clear? When we sin, these are consequences of sin, period, I guess you could say.
God refuses to listen to you.
Okay, so you do have a sort of a hindered prayer is an idea of like, it does create a wall or a barrier to some extent. That's at the end of the verse. Yeah, Caleb.
Can't see him.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
I was getting that from, and your sins have hidden his face from you.
Oh, okay, yeah, so I think you do have a build-on of that principle of there's kind of a hindrance, and even if you're going back farther, your iniquities have separated you from your God. There's just this communication through the whole verse that sin kind of creates this wall. If you look at Psalm 66:18, it's that if I hide iniquity in my heart. But that whole idea there that sin offends God, so that's the basis one, that sin is never not going to offend God. It hurts our fellowship and our ability to grow, and there is sort of this hindrance in our prayers that it has an impact. And again, going back to that basic principle, sin, like our choices matter, and those are things that happen when we sin, in a sense, regardless of what that is. And so, kind of moving on from there, we go to discipline. Excuse me. And I'll be in Hebrews 12, so this will be, again, if you want to turn there, you can. But Hebrews chapter 12, and this will touch on the next basic principle that we'll kind of look at. But Hebrews chapter 12, moving into the idea of the discipline of sin. And I'm going to read verses 5 and 6, and then verses 9 and 11. Make sure I'm actually at the right spot. So Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6 says, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives. And then, what did I say? 9 through 11. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed, for a few days, chastened us as seemed best to them, but he, for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. So you have in Hebrews 12, and then, there's a quote on 59 I want to make sure I get as well before I forget. So on page 59, 59, where is it? There it is. He just says, talking about Hebrews 12, God does not discipline us pointlessly, but for our good. So it's this basic principle that he touches on from Hebrews 12, is this idea that God disciplines his children out of love. And my question, so I say processing this, and he kind of does this a little bit in the book as well, so I'm kind of stealing and tweaking some of what he talks about right now or whatever. Like you look at authority, there's issues that need to be dealt with, and generally speaking, discipline isn't always thought of just at face value of a positive thing, but we know in Scripture, even when we just read from Hebrews 12, it is a positive thing. It's something that God does out of love. And so it's sort of a broad question, but in general, how can discipline just as a thing be loving? Or how is it loving?
I can remember an example of this. We would be in a store. My dad was a junior high teacher. And kids would come up to him and hug him and say, "Mr. Carlson, you were my best teacher." And then they would say some way that he corrected them. And I always thought, how does that make him your best teacher? But especially for the guys, I understood when I got older that they understood that he respected them and wasn't going to let them act like an idiot. And so he corrected them so that they would be able to be respected by others. And so maybe at the time didn't understand that, but they wanted someone to stop them and help them and correct them from just being dumb. And so every time they would hug them, they would say, "You were my best teacher." And most of the time, it was because he corrected them about something. As a kid, of course, I thought, that's weird.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I think in my own life, as a kid, remembering parents, I don't understand, even in middle school, high school, I'm not allowed to, my friends having a party when I was in high school. How come I can't go? It's just a birthday party. How, you always oh, they're all going to the movies. Why can't I just go to the movies? I look back, there's a dynamic of it that I think maybe hindsight sometimes is better. And I guess maybe it is important to note, discipline from a human standpoint isn't always done well, or it's not, if you're disciplining out of anger or something, that's obviously not right. But yeah, anything else? How in general can discipline, just saying how is it a good thing, or how can it be loving? Yep, Shannon.
In Hebrews 12, when you read verse 11, it really struck me that yielding the peaceable fruit of righteousness, that there's so much there between righteousness and peaceable, that's loving if the result is that, when I respond well to correction. So that discipline becomes a loving process to get me to that point.
Yeah, that initial no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but it seems painful. Nevertheless, it yields something in the end that but it has a purpose, which we'll get to. But anything else? I think we've touched on a lot of the principles. I don't know if anybody had something else. Yeah, Aaron.
As a young parent, when we discipline Daniel, we're pointing out his sin, and so it's loving in the way that we're helping them see that they are sinners and that they need God. Mm-hmm. And so it's directing them towards salvation, and that is loving because they need salvation to know that they're a sinner. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do. It's even as a parent, sometimes it's hard because you're they need to understand this. And so even when it's hard as a parent, that foundation of understanding there's a greater consequence for them not understanding the importance of sin kind of helps you pull back to for sure keeps it centered, at least for me, when I've just thought, what's the point? It's just the same thing again, but yeah. Well, I'm going to use that to, transition a little bit to the next part of conviction of sin, because I do think this is going to give that transition, or at least the tangible thing. And I just had noted there just how can it be loving. And again, I think everybody touched on it in some way. That growth, that it helps growth, it helps, or that clarity. There is care that I discipline because I care about my kids, I care about my students, I care about people. And then even just that involvement, to be able to do discipline correctly, in a sense you have to be aware of what's going on, and so there's an involvement in life that, again, that is, you talk about the sovereignty of God, of the comfort of it is he is so intimately involved in our lives that he is doing something, and that sometimes that discipline and what we'll see. But it's Psalm 32, and this will be the last passage because it actually gives us a great framework of the joy and peace of forgiveness, the not so pleasant stuff of conviction, but then the flip side of what is confection, that's funny. Confession, like confection oven. I lost it. Confession, like the process of confession, what it looks like, and then kind of how to execute is where we'll close. But Psalm 32, and I'm saying, I'm going to give you the question as I read this, but as we're looking at verses 3 and 4. So he says, when I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groaning all the day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into the drought of summer. So what are some ways that he describes conviction here? Groaning. So not usually a word associated with like birthday parties, or at least not good ones, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's very true. So groaning, you pretty quickly get a feeling of this image of what conviction is.
Heavy hand.
Heavy, like a burden, like it feels weighty. Oh, there's a little glimmer of like, no, there's absolutely nothing. When I kept silent, when I kept this in, my bones grew old. I was groaning day and night. This burden of heaviness was on me. My vitality, there's almost like the life is just drained out of me, like a drought in summer. And I'm like, again, you go back to that idea of struggle. But I think there's an important question because this, and I, again, sometimes it just a deal with it thing. Like it was always this thing that I almost dreaded as a Christian for a long time, that it was like I was afraid, and if I felt convicted, it was like, oh, and this, the people pleaser in me was like, I failed again, and this like negative view, obviously it is I say a negative emotion in the sense of it doesn't feel good to be convicted. And having a view of it like that, I think, affected me for a long time because it kind of kept me from responding to it where you're almost trying to be this like perfectionist Christian and not mess up so I don't have to get convicted. But actually, when you process it and think about what it really is an act of God's grace to expose something that we're not. You go back to this discipline of clarity and growth and his involvement in our life and care. And this was a quote he had on page 60. You can be sure of this, that when you choose to sin, God will not sit idly by and allow you to destroy yourself. God makes you uncomfortable about what you have done. And I just sort of added the question, why though? So he just makes me uncomfortable? Think Ephesians 4:30, this is just a quote I found from a commentator, that don't grieve the Holy Spirit by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. And this guy just said, grieving the Spirit is possible precisely because he cares deeply about his children. And I think about the difference between, you see a story on the news about someone you don't know, and not to say that it's not sad to watch, oh, this person made a decision and they failed. Oh, that's really sad. You look at that and it's broad, like my older kids, like the consistency that it hits me different when it's a child whose life I'm intimately involved with, or someone in my family, or is possible because he is involved in our life, because he does care about the decisions we're making. And again, going back to this conviction coming from a God who, like Hebrews 12 says, he cares about us. Like a father disciplines his children out of love and care to help them grow and improve, seeing the fruit of righteousness in their life. It's the same reason of just saying it's that care and that love that God has for us, and then it's sort of being exercised in the sense of conviction coming from a God that actually cares about us and is involved in our life and on an intimate level. So, kind of moving from there, we get to confession. And again, Psalm 32 it gives us a great sort of outline of this. It's verses 1 through 5. And again, going from like this burden of conviction and realizing the blessing of forgiveness that comes through getting right with God. And as a believer, eternal redemption is sealed in the life, or I guess the sacrifice and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then moving on from there, as a Christian, as we continue to fight sin, and it kind of affects that growth, that kind of relationship, or I'm sorry, the fellowship with God, that sometimes can ebb and flow with the decisions that we make on growing or not growing. We look at sin and our life, and what do we actually do with it? Like when I feel convicted or I know that I failed. And I think Psalm 32 gives a great sort of outline of that. So just to start at verse 1 to kind of give you the whole picture that he does through the first like 5 or 6 verses, or 5 verses. He says, "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groaning all the day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into the drought of summer. Selah." Then verse 5, "I acknowledged my sin to you, and my iniquity I have not." Selah. So you have in verse 5 a really helpful, I say, sort of outline of what confession actually is. So again, just looking at verse 5, what are some of the aspects of what going to God in confession is, or some of these components that he talks about in verse 5? Yep.
Just admitting that you have sinned is part of the very first step.
Yeah, that acknowledgement. I should have had them in progressive order, but that's the first step. You just see this acknowledgement, which is call it what it is. Like if there's sin, call it sin. It's describing.
Transparency. He says, I haven't hidden my iniquity, so there's a transparency
Mm-hmm.
about it. Just not acknowledging the transparency.
Yeah, that would be the next one, for sure. As far as I'm acknowledging it, but then there's at least the transparency and the clarity of not this broad stroke, but I'm not concealing this anymore. This is what it is, and not trying to cover it up or explain it away. So he goes from acknowledging this transparency, I'm not hiding it, and then what's the next thing he does?
Confess.
He says, "I will confess my transgression to the Lord," and then what's the result? Forgiveness. It's just, I acknowledge it, there's this transparency, I give it to God, I'm forgiven. And you almost can cycle back to the first verse. "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no conceit." And you have this beautiful cycle of the weight of conviction reminds me of God's love and involvement in my life. It pushes me to acknowledge sin, to be honest about it, to give it to God, and that forgiveness is given, and that's that restoration and that peace. And so I have here, and I added Proverbs 28:13, which let me just read that really quick because I've got time. Proverbs 28:13. It says, "He who covers his sin will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy." So Proverbs 28:13 adds the idea of forsake. So that's right, I just added that fourth. And then what's in yellow, just to be clear, that is the opposite. So it's when we say that first step of acknowledging sin, just it's there. The opposite of that would just to be ignore it. I'm just not going to think about it. I struggle with that in my own life, that I'm like if compartmentalizing was a spiritual gift, I'd be top of the food chain. Like that compartmentalizing where I can put some while it's helpful. But if I'm acknowledging it, it's usually a hindrance in my life. But we can do that with sin, whether you're as good at compartmentalizing as I am. I think all of us struggle with this in some form. I just don't want to think about it. And then I expose, so I'm going to acknowledge it, and I wrote the word expose. Like this is what it is. I'm not trying to cover it up, and that's why I say excuse. Well, let me justify. I know what I did was wrong, but da-da-da-da. And, we can be really quick at building a defense against something that we should be just being honest about. And then that confession of, I'm going to take it to God, I'm going to admit what it is, I'm going to seek forgiveness. And again, sometimes some of this process is also seeking forgiveness with another person. That's necessary. Part of that confession and that process is getting it right with a person. That's probably better, I guess, tied to expose. just to be honest, maybe if it's like you need to ask somebody for forgiveness because it's a sin against them. But again, generally just saying, acknowledging and exposing it, taking it to God. And then we say that forsake goes back to that idea of fighting and resisting and not being consumed and, I say consumed or defined by something. But there should be kind of a growth and a progression in our life as we're fighting and resisting sin, that we struggle, and yes, we might fail, but we always have, you go back to that 1 John 2, that hope and that comfort of an advocate, or the Hebrews 12, the involvement of a loving, caring Father that is trying to work in our life to guide us, to comfort us, to help us grow in that way. Now, dealing with this week, he had a question on page 68, and he just asked, what are some like takeaways that you had personally? And I'm just going to open up and see if anybody wanted to share that or if anybody had a question. But before I get to that, I did have two things I wanted to mention, and he does talk about this, page 65 and page 70. When you think about confession, if you say that word to like a Catholic, they immediately have that image of like going to a priest and going to confession. I remember there was a guy at our house when we lived in Virginia. We had a plumbing problem, and he was over there and just chatting with him. And, you invite somebody to church, whatever, and I go to the Catholic church down the road. I just went to confession on Saturday, and it's like, it opens up a really easy opportunity to just talk about Christ. And, but you do have this idea that I need to confess to, that Christ is our mediator and our advocate, that we don't need any other mediator. Like Christ is the best mediator, the best advocate that you could have. And again, even if you're just going from a logical standpoint, you're confessing sin to another sinful human being. That in and of itself is sort of an oxymoron. Like it just contradicts itself, two things that can't, in a sense, function correctly and for what it is. And so you don't have to go through a priest, and I think Hebrews is that 4 and 10 are probably the best explanation. Again, not that you're trying to shut people down, but if you're trying to explain that idea and that process, especially with someone who would be maybe a devout Catholic, Hebrews 4 and Hebrews 10 are great passages to just talk through, and that we don't need a mediator because Christ is that. He deals with the idea of condemnation after confession, so we still feel guilt. That was on page 65, which I think he did a good job of that. Or 62, I'm sorry. Page 62, he had like the chart between like, this is what conviction is, this is what condemnation is. And the idea, again, that Satan wants to continue to feel guilty or to feel like sin is too big in your life that you can't grow. And again, a good reminder of maybe as people struggle with that, like I've confessed it, but I still feel guilty. You do have that idea of 1 Corinthians 10:13 that God always provides a way of escape, that there is a victory that our relationship with God provides that we just don't have outside of that. And again, yes, there can be consequences, but that doesn't mean sin has to forever consume and define you. And the other thing I wrote too is work to not hold sin against people that have worked hard to make it right. Because it's easy sometimes, like when people have sinned against us or they've done things, to think, yeah, but I know what you did in the past. I know what your past looks like. Well, if you have people that have recognized it, say they go through this, whether it's getting saved or whatever the process is, like in their life as a believer, if they've worked to make those things right, it isn't helpful to hold those things against them. And we don't like it when our conscience holds sin against us. And we need to be really careful about holding sin against other people. It doesn't mean that we're naive. It doesn't mean that we make decisions like uninformed or we just kind of blindly do things. But it does mean, like a person that repeats a matter separates very close friends in Proverbs. We just have to be careful about that as believers, even within a church, that if people are working to make things right, don't hold it against them. Be part of the process of God's work and growth in their life. That's what I had this morning. I don't know if anybody had any, questions, comments, or even in your own life. Maybe maybe you have family that you've had to work through some of this stuff with, or as I noted, page 68, 3 significant takeaways that you would be willing to share or want to share as we got a couple minutes left. To maybe give a little bit more time, the 3 things I wrote down and I kind of tied this, I think I put it up there. He talks about it on page 66. But the idea of being specific, I think it's easy sometimes to just broadly ask God for forgiveness instead of really digging into my life and saying, no, I need to really process like what decisions have I made that I need to go to God and actually give them, like acknowledge, expose, confess. The other thing, and this is something I'm working on, is being quick. So it's like you have a thought or you say something you shouldn't say. There's like an immediate, nope, God, that was sin. I'm sorry. Like this confession isn't like, oh, I messed up. Well, I'll pray about it later. Like it's, you don't have to put that off, and really you shouldn't. As soon as sin happens, if it's something that you can jump on immediately, just give it to God, confess. And it doesn't mean that you don't come back to it later, but I think in the moment, this is something that I'm trying to work on, is just that immediate, no, God, that's anger, or that's not right. That's murmuring. And just call it what it is. Give it to God. But that quickness is something that helped me, that I'm like, I've got to work on that. Because again, I have a tendency to go, oh, I messed up. I'll pray about it tonight. And it sounds more spiritual when you're doing it, but you say it out loud, and I'm like, yeah, you're okay. But those are just things that I wrote down. I don't know if anybody's got anything any questions maybe, or something that you wrote that you just thought was a good takeaway. Yep.
I think when we put this in the context of discipleship, this is such an important concept, because it helps people stay in right relationship with God from the get-go, and to deal with sin. I think the longer we're saved, the more we have a tendency to hide our sin, and this just like starts at the beginning of their relationship with God, to really help them to not ignore it, not to excuse it, but to acknowledge it, to expose it. And so this is a really important concept that I think will actually help them down the road, even like dealing with assurance of salvation, and how to work through things, and because we continue to live in sin. So putting it in the context of that discipleship process, this is really foundational for continuing to deal with stuff.
Anything else? Yeah, Mr. Walt.
So is there a theological difference between confession in the Old Testament, when they had to deal with the blood of bulls and goats and stuff, and for us in the New Testament age, with the blood of Christ once for all, covering sin?
Yeah, you can probably help me if I think my brain immediately goes to that Hebrews, that like Christ is Jesus is better, kind of that overview, that maybe in principle it's the same as far as going to God, because that was that old process of, yeah, sins happened, you need to sacrifice. But looking at Hebrews is clear, like Christ is that sacrifice. You don't have to do that anymore. So I think there's a connection of principle and the sense of going to God for confession and doing what he's kind of outlined. But the beauty of it is that, again, I almost say the quickness of, like, I can go to God immediately in a moment in prayer, and that, like, sacrifice, but I'm just going to God, like he's the sufficient sacrifice. So I guess I would just say it, there's a consistency in the principle of, like, only God can forgive, but obviously the blessing of what Christ did is that Hebrews is an immediate, like, I have access to him. I don't have to get a sheep and go to the temple and do the process. But I would say it's connected, but obviously not the same, thankfully. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and stop there. We've got about 10 minutes or so, and we'll see you for the main worship service here in a few minutes.